Okay, folks. Hope y'all are having a great day here. Let's go ahead and get this stream kicked off. We are in, I think, week 5. I think it's week 5, which should mean that we're talking about revisions. And the revision process can be very arduous or pretty easy. It looks like I'm live on some part of... There we go. Let's turn that down. So the revision process can be very, very easy, and it can be fun, and it can be satisfying because you end up with this better product that's closer to your ideal, or it can be very arduous and painful, and it really just depends on how well you've executed those first two phases, planning and drafting. So if you made a good plan and you executed that plan well, then there's very little to do in the revision phase, just polishing. And if you didn't plan at all, if you are one of those gardener writers, that means all the work that you would have done in the planning phase, you now pretty much have to do like 8, 10, 20 times as much of it in the revision phase to fix the fundamental story problems that are going to pop up from you not really planning out what's going to happen. Now, if I'm being a little harsh on gardeners or pantsers, whatever you want to call them, that's simply because that's the reality. So the people who just start writing end up with a lot more work to do in the revision phase. For some people, that really plays to their personality. They like rewriting, they like revising. Some people do an extremely rough draft that's mostly just dialogue, and then they do a lot of work in the revision phase to add in all the other things that make it a book. It really depends on how your workflow operates and who you are as a writer. I'm going to be approaching this from the perspective of what I've done for this course, which is a planned document that then you've executed, and now you're looking to refine that document into something which can be published in the next phase. And I've also decided, I know I originally was like a 6-week course, I want to do 2 weeks, I think, on publication. There's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is that there's an enormous amount of information. I wouldn't be able to pack it into one live stream. In fact, I'm planning to focus most of my content over the next 2 weeks on just providing all the information people need to know, the technical nitty-gritty information for how to get your book published. I mean, how to put it out there on all the platforms, like how to get something perma-free on Amazon, for example. You need to have that. How to format your book, how to format a paperback, how to turn a book cover you may have bought into a paperback book cover without having to pay cover artists to do additional work there, things like that. I'll probably talk about some basic cover designs. I've done those in the past by replicating best-selling book covers, but I'll probably come up with a couple of maybe templates or just easy things that people can do for free, or for very low cost, because you still have to license the images that you're going to use for your book. But I'll show you some really, really low cost ways to design a book cover that actually looks decent enough, that's good enough at least to sell your book, because that's really what the book cover needs to do. And so I'll talk about that when we get to that phase, which means probably going to have to spread it over 2 weeks because there's just a tremendous amount of information. There's also a lot of information for this phase right here. And the problem with the revision phase is that it's so adaptable, kind of like drafting. It changes so much person to person. And there's a lot of information to cover. There's a lot of things that I want to direct people towards who've never revised or edited a book for publication. They've never approached things as an editor. There's a lot of things you have to think about with what you're doing it, and what level you're going to operate on, and what things you may possibly want to farm out to somebody else, and how you can do that maybe cheaply and effectively. So before I get to that, let me see if there's any initial questions that I can answer from the last couple of phases, and then we'll go from there. Ash has a question: what are good ways to improve your grammar so you don't have so much during the revision phase? Or is that not a big deal if... Oh, that got deleted. Yeah. What are some ways to improve your grammar? It's just going to be practice. It's just going to be practice, doing a lot of writing. That's the way that you're really going to revise it. I don't know why you retracted that, but that's the answer. Kyle says he's at about 12,000 words. I let my wife read what I have so far. She said my dialogue is good, but I did an info dump at the beginning, so we are trying to weave it into the story. So info dumps can be good or bad. It depends on how you execute them, right? It's all execution. So An info dump is probably preferable to trying to cram the information in awkwardly, but if you can really do the information well, it's helpful. And if you set the story up so that there's a character who can ask the questions the reader would have, and that provides the information, that tends to work a little bit better, or just to spread it out. Maybe I can give you. Here's something I wrote for. Let me get up this. Right now, my document is in like several places. It's in a Google Doc and it's in a Word doc because I've been typing on my phone while my daughter's asleep. It's been really hard to do the drafting phase lately because of how busy my family's been. The office of the sheriff was a lone building of boxy steel and quick-dry concrete, left over from the early days of the colony, not meant to stand for the decades it had endured, but rather to be replaced with on-world materials when the colony grew. So this is an info dump, but it's put into the description of the building. So I'm describing the building, and I'm also providing context for that. So why does the quick dry concrete and the steel matter? It's because it's an early colony building. So when this planet was colonized, they built cheap buildings to begin with that they brought in, on a spaceship, and then we're going to replace those with actual building materials generated from the planet. The colony, however, had not grown, and so the building had been kept up in good maintenance out of fiscal need. So again, that's an info dump. All around it was empty space. I'm going back to description. The temporary housing first erected around it had long since been demolished, and the ground, with the changing seasons of the unknown alien world, had become boggy and of little use, overgrown with the strange purple creeper that infested all the low places of Astera. Okay, so I'm weaving some info into that. So there's a little bit of execution. It's all about how you execute the information that you're trying to provide. If you can attach it to a description, if you can have a character say it, then it's not as obvious to the reader, and it also doesn't take them out of the flow of the story. And that's one paragraph of information that provides a lot of context for the setting. The other problem with info dumps is as you spread them out, they just tend to get... you tend to have a less concrete idea of how the setting works from the get-go. So that means when you are doing your initial descriptions of wherever you're at, if you're in a city, like if you're in, Fort Lauderdale or something, you want to hit the description in a way that it describes exactly the things that matter and that give an immediate picture to the audience's mind. This is actually some things I'm going to add into mine because I didn't do this very much when I was first writing it. I described all the action and I'm like, we don't have a great idea of what this town looks like, so I'm going to add in some description. So that's one of the things I do is as I'm writing, rather than going back as I'm thinking about what I'm writing, I'm constantly evaluating it. I just make a separate document with a bunch of notes. Add in a description here. Change this character's name. Delete this scene or replace it with something better. As I go, I tend to make a list of things that I'm going to do during the revision phase. And so that is something that I think is really, really helpful. So with info dumps, it's all about execution. I think if you can attach it to a description, it helps a lot. And by the way, yes, Ash, it's not a big deal if your grammar sucks on the first draft, as long as it's good by the time you publish it. If you have to hire a copy editor or someone to fix it all, that's fine, as long as it's published correctly. Let's see here. Fantasy fan, guilty, currently stuck on whether to proceed with my story in third person limited, which I have a chapter in, or omniscient. Probably go omniscient due to the exposition I'll need. We'll talk about that in just a second when I do. I'm going to do kind of a front-loaded lecture here in just a second to get all the information there. I've been stuck with writer's block for the last week. I went back and watched some of your older videos. May have discovered some of why. Perfectionism is another one of my problems. I've been very fear-motivated. Yeah. If you have OCD, that's going to be something you're going to have to get a handle on. You didn't plan the story out well in the planning phase. That's also going to give you hang-ups. That's true. I also haven't been reading much lately. Okay, thanks for reading Voices of the Void, though. I do appreciate it. So yeah, if you haven't planned really good in advance, it's easy to run into writer's block. So the way to fix that is go back to the planning document and just add more details to the plan. Go back to what you've done and add in all the details that you didn't put in the plan to begin with, and then the details for what comes afterwards are going to become more obvious to you. So in some cases, it means you gotta kind of up the details of your plan a little bit. And this is something I've done a couple of times. When I start to get to the midpoint of a document, I start to want to think with a lot more detail-oriented stuff with the execution, because midpoint's really hard to... It's really easy to bore people at the midpoint. It's really easy to lose track of what you're doing halfway through the document. You got to really be tight. So I tend to go back and make sure my plan is really correct. And I revise it depending on decisions I made, and then I finish it up. Film Girl says, I'm sorry I'm late. You B- minus in the class now. It's 5 tardies for you. I'm struggling in terms of how to present the dialogue. Do I leave a line between each conversation or not? No, each new speaker has their own paragraph. So if 2 speakers, it's paragraph, 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 paragraph. And that's the way that it has to look. So that's the correct formatting. And it would be indented every single time. And you don't have to put said after every single line of dialogue. If there's just 2 people speaking, just drop in who's speaking every once in a while, just to remind the reader, and they kind of get the flow of it. And as long as the voice of the characters are different from each other, it's going to be obvious who's talking. Yeah, let's see here. Do you think if you were a polyglot, would you be a better writer? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know if it would make me a better writer in English. It might, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think knowing another language helps you know other cultures, which in turn is going to just make you a better writer, but that's kind of a long way around. I don't know if it would improve your vocabulary. I have a full 100,000 word novel written, this after having written more than half a dozen books in the past few years, but I have no idea what to do next. We'll talk about that. Having trouble with dialogue in a scene where I still need small bits of information dropped in, but I'm having trouble making it seem natural. Ever have this problem? I haven't had this problem, but the solution is you either have to have the information in the dialogue, or you just have to add it after a dialogue tag. So, James said, he cocked an eyebrow thinking of this detail that you want to drop in. Thinking of how he was betrayed before. If you're in the personal perspective, it's really easy to drop character-centered information. As long as the character knows it, it's easy to drop it in. You can even do it in omniscient. It just feels a little more awkward, but you could totally do it. So you could just say, you could drop it in with thoughts, and you can drop it in with what I call, there's direct thoughts, which are like a quote, and then there's thoughts that are like, he remembered her brown hair. Right? You're just kind of describing somebody's thoughts. And so you can do that too. And that tends to feel pretty good. I've written over 64,000 words. I still haven't finished writing the ending. When is this due? Whenever you want it to be due. Whenever you want to put it out. All right. Let me talk about editing. So before I get into editing, there's something that I really want to talk about, which is editing services. So this little program that I've kind of been doing here, it's very, very focused on independent creators and not as much on people who are going the traditional publishing route. But whether you are in either of those pipelines, or you're trying to get into one of those pipelines or the other, this information is important. So there is a lot of companies and there's a lot of people out on the internet selling editing services. What are editing services? Well, it depends. They can actually mean a lot of different things. Editing usually means, in this context, you are paying somebody a certain amount of money to look at your book and tell you what to fix about your book. I'm not talking about grammar. Grammar is copy editing or typos, which is like proofreading. So I'm going to talk about all the different layers here. And this one really exists on probably the top layer, which is going to be story and characters and scene efficiency, things like that. Not so much copy, which is like your style or your grammar, but it may include that. So the editor exists to tell you what to fix about your book. The thing is that on the internet, there's a lot of people who frankly shouldn't be editing books. And there's an easy way to tell who shouldn't be doing it. Basically based on looking at their Twitter. It's not that hard to me. Like, I can tell a failed writer, and I don't like to call anything failed, but what I mean is somebody who is not successful at publishing books or writing books and making their income that way, and therefore they're looking to supplement their income by selling editing services to other authors, because there is, for these people and for lots of people, there's actually more money in selling services to other authors than there is in writing their own books. It's sad but true, and in some cases they may be writing books that are in such a niche kind of genre that even if they are a bestseller in that genre, nobody bought the book. I've described this on previous live streams. There's genres on Amazon that you can be in the top 20 by selling 1 copy, and you can be number 1 by selling like 4 copies. So you could buy 4 copies of it to give away and be a number 1 bestseller in some categories because of the way categories are set up. But a lot of these people, they write, if they're writing something like queer fiction, and they're like, hey, I'm open, I'm available for editing. So they tend to voice it a certain way, which is basically they're advertising as if they are busy. And whenever somebody advertises as if they are busy rather than I want your business, it's a big red flag to me. It's a big red flag that they are not really good at what they're doing. So there's a whole lot of authors out there selling these services. So if you were to look at a Twitter profile, I don't know if I want to pull one up because I really don't want to blast anyone. That's not really cool. But if they have 1 or 2 books that are out that you click on them and they're kind of buried in Amazon and not doing that good, and they have tweets that are like, I'm available for editing. If they're writing in really obscure genres, if they're writing things that are expressively LGBTQ+, these are people who have literature degrees and think that they want to be a writer, but they don't put out a lot of books. These are the people that are kind of trying to mooch money off of people. And so the editing phase is the first phase as a writer where people are going to be trying to take money out of your pocket and probably not giving you value in return. So let me talk about the 2 pipelines and how you need to approach these. So if you're going the traditional publishing route, or that's what you're trying to go, you probably shouldn't be looking for any kind of editing services. That is going to be provided by your publisher and is part of the process, okay? So you shouldn't be looking for editors to help you with your manuscript unless your manuscript is just completely awful and you have no idea how to fix it. And if that's the case, I recommend you put that book in a drawer, just put it out of your site, and instead of hiring an editor, you go back and you write a new story, because you will actually grow more from writing the new story than you will from trying to revise something that is thoroughly broken. And so sometimes if it's your first book, you didn't know what you were doing, and there's no way to fix it without writing a new story in place of that. So you might as well just write a new story at that point. And then you can fix everything before you begin the story. You can put in the right characters, right setting, right plot. You can think of everything you need before you do that. So if you're going the independent publishing route, if you want to work with an editor, the way to find an editor is not to cruise Twitter for other authors that are posting about am writing. In fact, if they're using the am writing hashtag, I just wouldn't really do business with them. If they're offering editing services and they use the am writing hashtag, stay away. They don't know what they're doing, right? There's a whole bunch of people on Twitter that like to just spend their time spamming am writing about something they're writing. I never talk about what I'm writing except maybe in this, where I'm talking about a manuscript that I'm going to be publishing as part of this process. I never talk about what I'm writing, or I very rarely talk about it, and I never spam it on Twitter. I'm doing a main character like this. No, I have a vision and I'm executing it, and you're going to see it when the book comes out. Because I don't want to talk about, I don't want to talk too much about it until it's done. I've talked about this one, but this is part of this process that I'm doing for this little course. So if they're doing that, then that's a big red flag. The way that you actually find an editor as an independent artist is you find whoever edited the book that you like and you want to be like. So if there's someone that's in the genre of your book that has an editor, and their book is doing very well, and you like their book and it's well written, then ask them who their editor was. or if they used one, and if they used one, who he was, and see if that editor will edit your book and figure out his pricing. Because the other thing you have to consider is the price. This is also one of the first steps where budget really starts to become an issue, because it may cost large amounts of money to have certain people edit your manuscript, and if it's not going to deliver value back to you, you shouldn't do it. It's really hard to know that, though, as a beginner who hasn't edited a lot other people's work, or who hasn't done a lot of writing to know kind of where their book is and where it needs to be. So in general, editing services should be approached with extreme caution. And the way that you find an editor is you find a real human being who actually edited a book that you like and you think was good in your genre and did what you wanted it to do and was like your book, because they're going to be able to produce the same product for you, right? It's the same thing with actually finding a cover designer, and we'll talk about that. If you see a #1 bestseller in your category that's an independently published book and you love the cover, go find that cover artist and see if he can do another cover that's like that for you. It's not that hard, but people get led astray so many times with so many different people offering services. It's much better to ignore any kind of advertising and find what worked for another author and see if you can do that. That's the best way to find an editor. Now, does that mean all editing is a ripoff? No, it depends on too many factors than I can even talk about. It depends on your genre, things like that. There are genres that really you should never think about hiring an editor, like erotica, right? You shouldn't even think about that expense because it won't affect the final product's quality. There's no one who wants to edit that kind of stuff, and you're just adding expense when it's not going to affect your sales or even the satisfaction of your readers when you get down to it. So anyway, that's my caution with editing stuff. So just be aware of that. Now let me talk about all the different levels of editing that we can do in the revision phase. This is the second info dump, I guess, the second little lecture, and then I'll get some questions. But actually, before I do that, let me see if there's any questions relevant to that little spiel, because I want to caution people. This is where people start to get their money milked out of them, as they start to think they have to hire lots of people and throw lots of money around to get their manuscript finished, and that's not going to be the case. I'm approaching this course as a self-editing thing so that you could potentially publish your book for free, or you could publish it for so little money that it's essentially free. We're talking like the cost of licensing a cover image, $10 on Shutterstock or Adobe Stock. And that's really where I'm directing this course. I don't want anybody to be losing a bunch of money on this. It just feels bad if you put a bunch of money into something, especially your first book. You're not going to make a lot of money in your first book. Put a bunch of money into something and then get nothing out of it. Like, I would really hate that. How different would writing stories be if the only writing systems were ideograms, like Chinese? I don't know, because I haven't read a Chinese novel, and I've only read really translations of Japanese novels. I really don't know. But Japanese writes would be written phonetically, not with like pictographs or something, or like hieroglyphics. I imagine it'd be quite different. I seem to remember coming up with stories being easier back in the day when I read more. Yeah, it inspires more ideas. So if you read more, watch more movies, play more games, you'll probably have more ideas. Also, if you get more distractions out, like the more quiet time you have, if you can just go for a walk. When I go running, like I run a 5K a couple times a week, like 2 to 3 times a week, sometimes a 10K, which is a little bit longer run. So 5 kilometers, it's a moderate length run. Gives me a good amount of time to kind of get out there with my thoughts and think about what I'm doing and think about what I'm going to do next with my story, or maybe listen to some music, or maybe even listen to an audiobook. I like my time. I like my cardio time. So if you don't have any of that time, think about, it's going to be good for you. Go for a walk. Get some exercise. It's good for your heart. And it'll be good for your mind to unwind and spend some time thinking. So that's what I do. If you could put a number on the importance of revisions, what would be 40% or 65%? It depends. If you've executed well, it's like 10%. If you haven't executed well, it's like 100% or like 80%. It just depends on how well you did those first 2 phases. Do you think the fantasy market will soon swing from long megabook series, a la George R.R. Martin, to something akin to sets of medium-length standalone or smaller books in general? Sorry if there's stuttering. There's a little bit of video stuttering on my end, so I apologize if the video looks a little weird on your end. I think things are okay. Looks like it's good, but I'm seeing a little video stuttering, so I apologize in advance if the video is not perfect. So I think things always react and go in ways that are novel. So I think we've had long mega books. I think readers might get bored of those and go back to the pulps. I'm writing things that are more in the line with the pulps. So as you can see, here's four fantasy novels, short length, that I wrote. And of course I collected the needle ash ones. And then here's a good moderate length one I wrote. This is really part one of Eternal Dream, and all three of these comprise part two because they're one story. Actually, I've got the wrong ones up there. All three of these. And then I'm going to have a separate line that's these shorter books. And part three, I don't know if it's going to come out this year because I stopped doing what I was doing on that to do this book that I'm going to do with you guys. So that'll probably come out next year, which is too long. It's too long to put, but it'll be about the same length, 120,000 words, which is... that's considered a long book, but by fantasy standards, it's pretty moderate length. I'm kind of hoping things will go down to the 60,000 word mark to 80,000 word mark, which is classic fantasy. So I think we may see a little bit of going back to that rather than these mega books. I think readers like to be able to sit down and read a book and be done. Sam Raimi said that there are 3 rules that all horror movies must follow. The innocent must suffer, the guilty must be punished, you must taste blood to be a man. Any thoughts? That's off topic, so... I don't really have any thoughts on it, though, anyway. Let's see here. Try to keep it on topic, because there's a lot of info I need to dump here. How does copywriting our book work? Excellent question. Let me address that right now. Your copyright is a concept that has particular things that are expressed legally. This is very confusing to a lot of new artists who aren't up to snuff on copyright and trademark law, which are 2 separate things. Most of the time when people are talking about copyright, they are actually talking about trademark. So using Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker is a trademark that's owned by Disney. Right, Jedi is a trademark that's owned by Disney. Those are concepts that have become trademarks because the story itself is copyrighted. Only an individual thing can be copyrighted. Individual book, individual story, that's all part of copyright. Your book is copyrighted as soon as you write it. Just like your music, you own the copyright. That just means that you own the intellectual property. It's a concept. You wrote it. Your authorship automatically confers you the ownership of your work. So you, on your copyright page, you don't have to file with the Library of Congress. You don't have to do anything with the government for your book to be copyrighted. It's copyrighted because you wrote it. That just means that you own it. You do not have to file that with anyone. That's an extra expense you can incur if you want to, but you absolutely do not have to incur that expense. In fact, disputes involving copyright are very rare and very, very zany. So a lot of people have this fear that somebody is going to steal their great idea, and the truth is that almost never happens. And even if they stole your great idea, you actually would have a very hard time in a court of law getting a copyright judgment unless they took your book word for word and published it without your permission. That's an actual copyright violation. Versus if they had story elements that were similar to yours. This has actually never really been figured out in court, to my knowledge, like the nitty gritty of this. I don't think you'd actually be successful suing them, just so you know. There was a famous example where, I'm trying to remember the name of the author. He was a science fiction author. He wrote Star Trek episodes. His name's escaping right now. He sued, I think, Fox and James Cameron for the movie Terminator because he wrote a story that was very, very tangentially somewhat similar. This idea of a soldier coming from the future and fighting another soldier in the past. But Sony just paid him. The truth is, I think they should have taken that to the mattresses because it would have made him really clear that some little story element you have, you can't own that. You own your book, right? You can even say that like a character's name is important. But if it's sufficiently different, just because you have time travel in it doesn't mean that you own the other person's story. That's nonsense. Anyway, that's an aside there. So if you want to file with the Library of Congress, there's a website to do that, loc.gov, I think. And it costs like $25 per work. And all it does is it puts a copy of it at the Library of Congress and sends you a letter that says that they have a copy of it at the Library of Congress. And if there's a dispute, you just say, well, my copy was submitted to the Library of Congress on this date, and you published yours on this later date. But even then, if you published it on Amazon, I published mine on January 1st, and you published yours on March 30th of the next year, you clearly own the copyright at that point, right? I think filing with the Library of Congress, I do it, but it's just kind of like it's really not that necessary in my opinion. This doesn't constitute legal advice, and in no way does this constitute legal advice. I'm just telling you that copyright's a concept. Okay, so you don't have to worry about really some kind of significant legal thing. You can just do the Library of Congress form and upload a digital version of your file, and they will send you a letter that says they have it on file. And you can hang on to that in case you need to litigate with someone. Let's see here. Someone says, I wonder if we'll see something akin to digital pulp era. Absolutely. It's happening right now, and we're getting in on it. So you're getting in on it right now. I'm getting in on it right now. I've been doing it. This is what it is. Film Girl, would I have to go to a publishing company to get my book published, or as you say, it's better to just track down one editor and hope for the best? If you're going to I'll talk about that with the publication phase. If you're going to publish the traditional route, you don't talk to publishers, you talk to agents. So you query agents. You're going to find an agent the same way you would find an editor, which is you figure out who the agent was for a book that's really similar to yours, and you go query that agent, and you just go down the list until you find an agent to represent your book, and then the agent will hopefully find a publisher for your book, and then you'll negotiate with the publisher, and then they'll figure out what revisions they want to make, what changes they want to make, and then it'll finally get published. It's a long process. If you're going to self-publish, which is what I'm going to focus on for the publication phase, then you should not go through any publication company at all. You're going to do this completely on your own. You would hire out all of the work involved. So you'd hire someone to do the cover, you'd hire someone to do an editing, you'd hire a person to format your book, or you'd format it yourself or do any of those things yourself. And then you would yourself put it on sale on Amazon. And it's actually very easy, and I'll go step by step for how to do that, and I'll have videos coming out for that. So it's good to think about that now, but we'll get to the details in a couple weeks. Nitaku says, my book is going to be late. I have to find a new job right now. That's fine. Do it when you can do it. New jobs take priority, right? Because you gotta keep food on the table. Do you know of any famous editors? Maxwell Perkins. Yeah, I think he helped Ernest Hemingway when Ernest Hemingway was having mental difficulties organizing himself. F. Scott Fitzgerald. I probably wouldn't. I don't like his books very much, so. Yeah, I don't know of too many famous editors, other than, guys like, who am I thinking of? Name fell out of my head. I'm sorry. There's a couple ones that were famous. Or there's editors who ran magazines, but they didn't really engage in editing. And that's the thing, man. It's like, if somebody's going to tell you how to make their book better and their books are not better in that way, that's a problem, right? They're selling you expertise they don't have. And the truth is, there's lots of people with degrees in English that think that confers upon them some sort of expertise when it actually doesn't, because the world of writing books is far different from the world of college. It's really different. What's the best way to describe new objects? Singing flowers into my fantasy universe. Just mention it as like a passerby or in a different way. So if it's passé for the characters involved, you just mention it in passing. They walked past a row of blah 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 flowers. I don't know of a name. And the flowers were singing out their song. And Billy plugged his ears because it was too loud. Like, you just describe it that way. And people go, oh, singing flowers, that's interesting. But you wouldn't want to draw attention to it in a way that the characters wouldn't have attention to it. Really, this is a weird thing, but prose kind of expresses the perspective of characters more than the reader. And it's kind of a bridge between the reader and the characters. What's the best way to okay, we just did that. Okay. I jumped down, missed it. Have you ever played Lego games? I have played some, but that's off topic. Thank you for doing the stream. I haven't been excited. Sorry. Video game developer Anas Abdin recently lost a copyright battle against CBS. They ripped off his giant blue teleporting tardigrade idea and used it in Star Trek Discovery. Again, because it's an idea, it's not actually under copyright. Only the work is under copyright. So if you're like, hey, I'm going to sue you for copyright because you have a time travel machine that's spherical and my time travel machine is spherical, it's not going to work out, I don't think. And that's because that's not a copyright issue. I know that sounds weird. That'd be like suing someone for using a C major chord. It's like, I used the C major chord in my song and you used the C major chord in your song. Copyright. No, it has to be a lot more than that, right? It has to be same melody, same chord, same time signature, same everything, right? And then you've copied it sufficiently. But it's the same thing for books. Like, it has to be a really on the nose copy, or people are going to see and be like, wait a minute, and you could just, as a lawyer, it'd be really easy to make that argument. It's like, okay, should the Hemingway estate sue somebody for having a war scene because one of Hemingway's books had this? No. These are common tropes. Anything that's a common trope doesn't fall under copyright. So, there's a blue tardigrade, but there's also Bill and Ted. Bill and Ted, they time travel in a phone booth. So Bill and Ted, they time travel in a phone booth. Woo, in Star Trek, they time traveled by jumping through portals. Does that mean they should sue Stargate? Because Stargate had a round portal, and the City on the Edge of Forever had a round portal. It's like, no, these are just kind of tropic ideas. They're not, they're not subject to copyright. In my opinion, this is not legal opinion. The writer referring to is Harlan Ellison. Thank you, Ash. Yes, Harlan Ellison sued because he wrote a story that was very, very, very broadly similar to the first Terminator movie. And James Cameron was upset they settled because he felt like his story was really different. And it was, actually. In my opinion, it was extremely different. That doesn't mean it's not on derivative in some broad way, right? Like time travel, yeah. But, I think time travel wasn't new by that point. Film Girl says, thank you for your time. I haven't been this excited about a project since university. Good. I'm glad. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that kindness. Are you familiar with the snowflake method of writing? I'm not. Maybe I should be, but I don't know what that is. Is that where you cry about not getting your way? You cry about how special you are and how you need special treatment? Is that the snowflake method of writing, where you, instead of writing, you cry about how you couldn't finish your book because you're too far up on the progressive stack? Do you think writing on paper or a typewriter could actually be better for editing and revisions than writing on a computer? Excellent question, Ash. What a great question. I'm going to answer it a couple ways. So first of all, yes, actually, if you write it down on paper or on a typewriter and then have to digitally convert it by manually retyping it in, you are adding a layer of editing, which means you are rewriting it a little bit as you're transcribing it. So each time you transcribe it, you're looking at the core line. You're looking at this sentence, and it's an opportunity to fix any sentence that's awkward, any sentence that's weird. So it's just running everything through that filter automatically, which is actually a big benefit. Now, it takes a lot of extra time, but it does provide that benefit. Here's the other thing. I know of several writers that I've met who print their books out on paper and look at them that way. And I have done that myself, and I continue to do that myself for a lot of books. I will print them out, the whole book, 500 pages of text. And I'll go through it line by line, and I usually format it big like it's going to be on a 6x9 book. I look at the actual formatting of it, and I go through it, and I mark things and things like that because it keeps me off the computer. It's different. I knew an author named Steve Yarborough who He would write like 2 pages a day, and he'd print off the 2 pages at the end of every day, and he would go through them, and he would say if there's any, and he would correct anything that wasn't perfect, any sentence that wasn't right. So he was editing his content at the end of every single day. He was printing it off. He's like, maybe it wastes paper, but I have to look at it on paper to see what my words, see them out loud, and then fix them. I would hate for someone to think I wrote a bad sentence, is what he said. So he used to do that, and that's one way that you can do it. You can edit as you go. I did that sort of for Muramasa. So for Muramasa, I posted everything as I went. I put it on my blog. This was years ago. So I put up 1,000 words a day, which meant before I put that blog post up, I looked through it, fixed anything, and kind of had an editing layer there, and then I put it up and posted it. And it worked actually really well. So by the time I got around to actually publishing Muramasa as a book, here's the first edition. Bye-bye, Piglet. Piglet fell over. Here's the first edition. By the time I got around to this, there wasn't any more work to do. The only work, I cut like a couple scenes, I fixed like a few little style things that I decided to fix, and then I published it. I'd already done the editing as I went. Don't always recommend that. Most people have trouble shifting back and forth like that, but it's something that you can do, and I probably should have mentioned it before, but it's something you can do. Okay, I'm having trouble making my characters speaking style unique from one another, specifically the children who talk the same as adults. How do I fix that? And here's an easy way: is children talk with more contractions than adults do, right? They talk with fewer words, they drop words. So children, that's one way to do it. So I have characters it's kind of a cheap way to do it, but it works. So if a character is overly formal, obviously they speak with fewer contractions. If they always are trying to be clear, they speak with fewer contractions, and other people speak with more. They drop words out. So a character who's very formal would be like, "Do you understand?" And another character would be like, "Know what I mean?" That's the same meaning, but different voice. And so that's one way you can do it, is have people that speak with more contractions, more down-to-earth style, and people would speak with a higher style, depending on their character. And then some people have things that they say all the time. Like I say particular a lot. So maybe a guy says particular a lot. Maybe he says, "God's below," something like that. All the characters said "God's below" all the time in the Malazan books. God's below. Whose breath? So maybe there's a character who says "whose breath," and we're like, "Odin's bones." Whatever their expression is. "I'm a doctor, Jim, not a bricklayer." "Jim, he's dead." Right. So the voice of Dr. Bones, he has an attitude, and so a lot of those things come up. "I'm a doctor, damn it, not a bricklayer." "He's dead, Jim." Right. So that's a way to give them good voice. In a nutshell, the snowflake method is starting with the main idea and branching the rest of the story off of it like the spokes of a snowflake. That makes no sense to me. I'll just tell you right now, it doesn't make any sense to me, but that's okay. If that makes sense to you, go for it. Yeah, I can't write like that. I write events that happen in order for reasons. That's how I write. That's me. I'm kind of a linear dude. Whatever. All right. Let me dig into this next big bit of information you need to know. So when you are going to self-edit, here's what you need to know. You're going to be editing on multiple levels, starting with the broadest and going down from there. And now you can combine some of these. You can put them in different orders, all that kind of stuff. However, the more you're able to focus on one of these things at a time, the better it's going to be. So the top level, and this is where if you were working with an editor, their primary focus would probably want to be. It's what I call the story level. This is going to be the plot and the execution of the scenes within the plot. So let's say you have a set of events that happen in a certain order. You're going to be looking, do those events happen in the right way? Are they the right events, or do I need to swap them out for a different event? Does Jimmy fall down and break his collarbone, but that creates, but we don't really follow through with that. Let's remove Jimmy breaking his collarbone. Is it the wrong character doing this? Is this something that you set up but don't actually deliver anything on? Like if you set up somebody being if you have a character interaction with a character and this character is a jerk, and then you don't see that character the rest of the story, obviously you got to cut that. So this is all story level stuff. So it's going to be plot, execution, scene function. Do you need to cut this scene? Do you need to rewrite this scene? Making big decisions about your story to make the story correct. That's the first thing you have to fix. Because if you try to do this later, you're going to be wasting time trying to fix copy editing issues when you're going to delete that scene or rewrite it. Okay, that's the big level of editing. It's going through and making those decisions. And you'd be maybe marking a scene for revision. You'd rewrite it if you feel like that scene needs to be rewritten, or maybe you delete a scene and replace it with a different scene in a different place. This is something I do from time to time. Delete a scene and replace it. Next level down is what I call scene execution. This goes down to, are the right events happening in this scene? Are the characters actually being characterized? Are they revealing things about themselves? Is the prose describing things correctly? And then below that is actually dialogue. Are they saying the right thing? So when you ask, how do I make sure that they have different voice? That's the dialogue part. So before you get to dialogue, you got to get to the story events. Are all the story events there and correct? Then we go down and we look at the dialogue. Is he saying this the right way? Is this in the voice of the character? You go through each piece of dialogue and you change it if it needs to be changed, replace it if it needs to be replaced. This is where, in fact, this is probably, if you're going to, other than the big story stuff, the dialogue is probably the most important. It's the thing the readers never skip. So it's the thing I tend to focus on the most. Is this dialogue sharp? Does it communicate the right things? Is it in the right voice? Does it sound like somebody, like this character would actually be saying that? And then from there you get down to prose style, and the next level down from that. So the prose style would be, are you writing in the correct tense? Do you maybe have some passive voice stuff going on that maybe needs to get fixed? Passive voice is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can make a certain sentence more confusing than it needs to be. I've talked about this in the past. Passive voice is good for removing an actor from an action and just showing the action. But in some cases, that makes things confusing. So if you have that, or if you have a series of very dry active statements, he jumped over the log, he ran across the bridge, that kind of stuff, that maybe you combine those, get down to the style, make sure the prose is really good. And then from there, you're going to go down to what's called copy editing. So copy editing is where you are making sure that you are using correct grammar, that you're not substituting wrong words. An example of a copy editing issue would be if you say, he has less horses than I do. He has fewer horses than I do. That's usually a copy thing. And then so you're just looking at grammar and really basic style stuff. And then you go down to the lowest level, which is proofreading. Proofreading is getting rid of typos, spelling errors, things like that. All that's going to happen at the proofreading stage. Now, people who are new at this, what they think is proofreading is editing, or that all of this stuff is done at once. When in reality, if you hire an editor, he's probably not going to be fixing your spelling mistakes, nor really should he waste his time with that. But he's going to be fixing your story and maybe fixing your style stuff. Fixing, hey, this paragraph's confusing. You should rewrite it. Or this paragraph's not the best. Maybe you should fix a couple of these sentences. Or I don't like this dialogue here. It doesn't sound like the character's voice. Maybe you should fix that. Just that top level stuff. And then really you would hire someone else to proofread it, or which is going to be much less expensive than actual editing services. So I may actually do a proofreading. I may actually use a proofreading, like a proofreader, for this next book, because I just don't have time to do it myself right now, and it's an expense. It's not a terribly huge expense for a 20,000, 30,000 word book, but we'll see. And you can decide on each of those. So this is what I really want to get across, is each of those is a different level of what you're doing. And let me think if there's anything else there's one other thing that I wanted to say that I think is actually pretty important. Oh, consistency. So this happens up at the top levels, the story and scene execution. Consistency would be, say, making sure the characters always have the same voice throughout the book, or the characters have the same physical traits. Somebody found me on Twitter and said, hey, this character you had in Prophet of the Godseed has blue eyes in one scene and green eyes in another, which is something I never caught. I'm like, okay, well, I'll fix that, right? They should have the same color eyes in both scenes unless there's a light changing their eye color, or they're changing their eye color as like part of the story, but it's not. So you want to make sure those things are consistent. Sometimes when you're writing a book, the character, their physical traits kind of change in your mind by the time you get to the end of the story, and so there could be consistency errors. You may have changed the name or it might be spelled differently in different places. All of that is consistency stuff. Broad consistency would be the character speaks with the same general style, and then tighter stuff would be making sure your place names are the same eye color, things like that. Okay, so that's what you need to know about self-editing. As far as what you're doing, the way that I would recommend you approach self-editing is first read through your story and just see how you feel about it. Then maybe read through it again and ask yourself a question, and you can do this really the first read through too. For each scene, you want to ask 3 questions. Is this scene necessary? Meaning, if I cut this scene out, would the story be otherwise intact? And if the answer is yes, you should probably cut it because it's just not necessary. Am I furthering the development of characters? Am I furthering the plot? Am I exposing the setting? For 4 things, really, right? So, setting, characters, plot. If you're doing all 3 of those in a scene, chances are that scene is going to be efficient, and it's going to be good, and it's going to be memorable. If you're doing 1 or 2 of those things, you may want to leave the scene in, or you may want to transplant that information to another scene and sort of squish scenes together and rewrite both of them to be one more coherent scene. So, for instance, let's say you had a scene that was 2 characters talking and kind of developing their relationship with each other, which I do a lot of this kind of stuff. If it's just happening in the absence of a plot event, you might want to just take that dialogue and rework it so it can fit next to a plot event. And then you can get rid of that scene and shorten the book. Generally, if you're cutting the length of your book, you're going to make it stronger. Now, in my editing, I tend to actually add to the length of the book because I make a bunch of notes for little things I want to add in that I just skipped over at the beginning because I tend to write the prose fairly quick. So mine tends to stay the same or slightly grow, but at the same time it grows, I also am like cutting scenes. So I look at and combining scenes and doing what I'm talking about to just make the entire manuscript a lot more tighter. So a lot tighter, not more tighter. So each scene, if it's doing all those 3 things, keep it. If it does none of those, cut it. If it's only doing 1 of those, try to put whatever it's doing in another scene and then cut it. And then you're going to make your manuscript a lot more efficient. And then from there, prose style, read through it, make sure it sounds good. You can read it aloud, hand it to somebody else who is an avid reader and see if there's anything that pops out to them. And then if you want to do proofreading, there's a couple ways to do proofreading. So you can proofread it yourself by reading it through a bunch of times and fixing typos. Or you can do that yourself and maybe give it to a family member or a friend who's very well read or who's done this kind of thing. If you have any family members who are English teachers. Like I know my friend who I've had on the show various times, Matt, I think he has an uncle who's an English teacher. So for one of his earlier stories, he just handed it to his uncle and his uncle just proofread it for him and like nailed everything. As an English teacher, he's like laser vision, finding every single spelling mistake, grammar error, all that stuff. His proofreading was like dynamite, and then it was ready to be put out. That being said, do not expect even a very competent proofreader to catch every mistake. There's always going to be some mistakes that get through. There are typos in C.S. Lewis and Tolkien to this day. Each time they reset the manuscript, they introduce more errors. So there's probably more typos in Lord of the Rings now than there was 20 years ago because they've retypeset it a bunch of times. So each time there's a new setting of it because of transcription errors and setting up plates if they're doing old-fashioned printing. You drop a period. I know my version of Chronicles of Narnia is missing end quotes all over the place, and there's a bunch of little spelling errors that just for some reason, like maybe went to an American press and they thought, I don't know, they just didn't catch the spelling error. I don't know. So there's always going to be little things that get through. Luckily, if you're doing this independently, you can fix that. Big name publishers, they still publish stuff with typos. It happens. I was reading, what's the new Brandon Sanderson? Was it Oathbringer? The last Stormlight Archives book. It was not a good book in my opinion, but there was a typo on like the title page. Typo on the title page, guys. So it happens. Don't get too upset if you get a review that's like there's a typo, because everyone has them. Just some people get upset about them. I don't. I see typos, especially if I buy something like opening day. There's gonna be some typos even from like big name authors that I love, and then I know those will get fixed somewhere down the line. Should I use contractions in the prose narrative? Very good question. I use them, but I try to keep them to a minimum because I want the prose to feel pretty formal. So if you're doing something formal, you kind of want to minimize that. So I think the contractions I use are things like couldn't instead of could not, because could not sounds a little odd, but just depends. I'm looking at my prose now, and there's pretty much no contractions. I use virtually none. Yeah, so I use very, very few contractions, but I wouldn't say you can't at all. I have a character that is very crude and uses few contractions and often ends his statements with a, I think that may be an example of what you're saying there. Yes, exactly. So he has a thing that says, huh? A? There's dudes who just say A all the time, or, America. So we have this thing in North America where all Canadians say A as a confirmatory thing at an end of the sentence. He's pretty tall, eh? And I pointed it out. I'm like, you guys say A lot. And he goes, well, Americans say huh all the time. I'm like, huh? It's like, yeah, Americans say, it's pretty good, huh? It's a pretty good, eh? Right, it's confirmatory question at the end. Any quick tips to keep a soft magic system awe-inspiring, not simply like anything can happen? Have a spell fizzle. Or keep it to the minimum. And also, as long as if your main characters don't know magic, it's easier. So if the main characters don't know magic, then it's pretty awe-inspiring. Soft magic system. There's a bunch of examples I've gone over. Like Harry Potter actually has a really soft magic system. Doesn't seem that way. But you notice the adults essentially have limitless magical power, and the children have no idea what the hell is going on. So they have like 10 spells they know, and the adults can like transmute matter into squirrels. So it's actually a soft magic system, and that way the kids are always in danger because they never know as much as their opponent. Is there any way to snap out of the brain autocorrect thing that can cause one not to see errors? Saying it aloud is probably the best way I've found, but it's hard for me to catch my own mistakes. I'll probably rely on a proofreader. I might. I have nobody that I can give manuscripts to for proofreading purposes or for feedback, really. So I have to operate kind of just out on my own and try to catch as much stuff as I can myself. I know for Voices of the Void, the pre-release version had like a bunch of errors in it. And I think Hardwick, you sent me an email that was like, here's all these errors. And I went and looked. I'm like, I can't find any of these errors. Is this the version on Amazon? Because my current version didn't have any of these errors in it. So I was freaked out for a minute because I'm like, oh no, is the version that's on Amazon not the right version? Turns out the version that was on Amazon was the correct version. I think it is. I re-uploaded. I think I corrected like one thing that I remembered from that, and then I re-uploaded everything just to make sure. But there's I don't talk about this in publication, but we might as well talk about it now too. So if you're doing a Kindle pre-order, you actually need to have, you used to be able to just put up an unfinished manuscript and then re-upload a new file. Turns out if you do that, Amazon will remember the first file you uploaded and will send that out to whoever pre-ordered when that first file was up. So you need to make sure it's happened, and I think it happened to me, but you need to make sure that your final version is what's actually on Amazon when you set up the pre-order, when you upload the manuscript. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. Now, you can set up the pre-order without uploading the manuscript, though. You can set up the pre-order 3 months in advance. Then, 2 weeks in advance, you upload the final document. You're good to go. So, Just be aware of that. Is that sometimes things are like that. So anyway, I had that. People were still, that means I need to update my book funnel files, because people will think that that's a current version, even though it says like pre-release version, which just means it's the version that I put out before I did my final editing. I actually changed a bunch of little editing things too. So I really do need to update it. But anyway, there's that. How do I come up with a good sounding title and blurb for my story? That is an excellent question. We will talk about that next week, and when it comes time for publication. So I'm going to skip it this week. We'll talk about it next week. It has to do with your genre, and it has to do with whether it's a series. There's a bunch of little things that some people are really, really killing it with. I'll talk about those. Jared says, one thing I found is I'm good at writing dialogue, yet I find myself over-explaining some of the exposition. I'm guessing you mean prose. Yeah, any advice on how to fix that? Just see if you can just look at a paragraph and see what sentences you can cut out, and then go from there. Or anytime that there's a compound sentence, see if you can make it non-compound. Make it one statement. And sometimes that's it. Then all of a sudden the prose feels a lot better. Simple prose is generally better than like long, complicated prose, because you're trying to tell a story. You're not trying to impress someone with how complicated a compound sentence you can make. You don't want someone to look at your sentence and be like, this looks like Thomas Aquinas could have written this. It's like, no, you want them to read the story. Is play acting your characters before actually writing a scene a good way to come up with dialogue? It's up to you. That's not how I do it, but you can do it. Absolutely, if it works for you, do it. There's no set way to do it. My wife got home. Got to go. Have a good day. A Renaissance Fair in Folsom, California this weekend. So I got to repair my armor tomorrow too. Oh, Folsom. I didn't know there was a Ren Fair there. I'm trying to remember. That's cool. Have fun. How good is Grammarly? Is it worth paying for? In my opinion, no. But it's another tool. So the reason I'm going to say no is simply it does not replace human eyes. It can't. It won't be as good as an actual person trying to proofread what you got there. The other thing is Grammarly is really designed for nonfiction writers. So people writing articles. So if you're writing lots of articles, yeah, it's probably fine. It's probably like a good product. I have it. I've used it for various things. It's not good at catching typos. It's not good at catching actual grammar errors, especially grammar errors as you're writing fiction. It thinks everything's an error that isn't an error, and then it misses all kinds of other errors. So it's not very good for fiction, but it is another tool in your arsenal. If you're writing a lot of blogs, it's probably a pretty good product to have when you're like writing your blog, because it'll have a lot of that stuff. But the problem is, if you want that to replace human eyes on your manuscript, it's probably not going to do that very well. It's kind of okay, but you have to really be on top of knowing your stuff, because if you take its suggestions, you're gonna hurt the quality of the manuscript for sure. Same thing with Word. Will always tell you that you need to put the word that in there. No, you don't need that. He put on a hat, or I'm trying to think. Yeah, the word that as like a little word that goes in between clauses. You really don't need that for most things. You can have it or you can not have it, but if you take Word's advice, it's going to be all over the place and it's going to be too much. How many proofreaders does one normally require? How many proofreaders do you have? I have no proofreaders. I have me. I can't rely on anyone. And that's not a dig against anyone. I just don't have any free proofreaders. So I would hire one proofreader that was for money, and I would expect them to catch everything. And if they didn't, then that's a problem. That would annoy me. So it just depends. If you can give your proofreading over to a couple people who are knowledgeable, and this is especially true if you're not a native English speaker. If you can hand your manuscript to somebody who is a native English speaker and have them give some feedback as to style, that helps a lot. Because there's a bunch of little idioms in English, a bunch of little things that are unique to the language or the place where people speak it and the history of writing the language that if you're not a native English speaker, you may not pick up on. You may not use them, or you may actually work against them. So you may use an idiom accidentally or slightly incorrectly in a way that a native speaker is just going to pick up on it right away. Same thing if I were to write in another language, I would definitely be hiring a proofreader or somebody like that, or just handing it to a friend who spoke that language and could give me feedback. Hey, does this work in language? And there's lots of people who, I've done content with various authors who are European, that maybe they're from Denmark or Germany. And of course, they speak Danish or German natively, and English is their second language, or in some cases, their third or fourth language. I got around to, I've met a guy who was from Spain, and he spoke Spanish. English was like the fifth language he learned. He was like, yeah, I knew Spanish, German, Italian, Dutch. Then I learned English. Because now I don't even talk to anyone in Dutch, So yeah, if I was going to publish in Dutch, for instance, I would definitely hire somebody who spoke Dutch to tell me, hey, we have an expression here that you're trying to get to here, or this is an expression here that you don't want to use in this context because it doesn't make sense. Little things like comb the desert. Doesn't mean to drag a comb through the sand. It means to search. So we use words like comb, meaning to search. Realism tip when writing Canadian dialogue. Canadians with an accent don't actually pronounce about as a boot. They actually pronounce it as a boat. Yeah, that's an American thing. Oh, he says a boot. No, it's a boat. It's pronouncing the U as an rather than as a oo. A boat. That's correct. From all Canadians I know, but a lot of them don't speak that way. And then there's like a Newfoundland accent, right? If you guys ever met anyone from Newfoundland, the Newfies, they have a really particular kind of accent that's almost hard to describe. It's I can hear it almost as like a sing-songy kind of accent. It's really unique in North America, kind of like a Brooklyn accent. It's like you speak it in between these 20 blocks in New York. That's like talk, It's like nobody, or like a Boston accent. Most of the people in Boston don't speak with a Boston accent. It's a really unique accent. Oh, yeah. What do you think about misspelling words on purpose to show a character's way of saying things? Like instead of you, or they say your, or instead of don't. Okay, this is called patois or phonetics when you are doing it. I say do it sparingly. You can do it for a little bit of flavor. But if you go overboard on it and a reader is looking at it and he has to stop and scratch his head and say, what did that character just say? You're doing it too much. So if it's Pikey Come Again, like if it's Brad Pitt from Snatch, where it's intended for him to be completely indecipherable, that's really hard to do in a book, and you probably don't want to, because people will be sitting there scratching their head at dialogue that they have to then decipher the phonetics of. In general, I would say avoid it unless it gives that little flavor to the character. So, if you have one of these like D&D dwarfs and he's like, watch your mouth, right? With this, that kind of country accent, you best be getting your mining pick. We're going to be going down into the mine, right? You would write mine as M-I-N-E, not moine, not like O-I-N-E, how they actually pronounce it. You would say mine, right? But you'd be imagining your head, moine. Get your pickaxe, you might write Y-E-R for that. And that's your flavor. You kind of want to clue, if you can clue the reader into the accent. Suppose you be getting on your horse and be getting out of here. Or Samwise Gamgee, Miss Gardner. What are you, his bodyguard? Miss Gardner. Even you couldn't say no to that. So I say do it, but do it sparingly. If you come across any line of dialogue, or if you hand it to a friend to read, just like get some feedback. And you guys, if you're new to this, just hand your stuff to people who are interested in your art. It's, for me, there's very few people in this world other than my wife who actually want to read anything I have written. I think my mom's read one of my books. My mother-in-law's read one of my books. My wife's read all of them except for Voices of the Void, which is not for her. She can't handle the gore in a book like that. But, get a little feedback. They say, what is this character saying? You're like, probably put too much of that regional dialect in there. Let's dial it back. Let's have just YER instead of like Moyne or something like that. I'm extremely behind and am nowhere near editing, but as I write, I make notes to myself in red places that I need to rewrite when I edit. Is this a good idea? That's exactly what I do. I don't do it in the document. I do it in a separate document so that the drafting document's really clean. I like it to look really clean. But yeah, I do the same thing. And it's a good idea because then when you go back to edit, it's kind of like you have a checklist of stuff to do, and you can just go through it and do it, and it's good to go. Do I need a proofreader? I'm dyslexic. I would recommend it if you're dyslexic. And that is not anything against you. It's just you may miss a... So people who are dyslexic tend to write some things phonetically that don't make phonetic sense. They tend to fix things in their mind in some cases. Like they see the first part of a word and like fill in the blank, and so they may miss spelling mistakes when they're reading it themselves. It's probably a good idea if you have a disorder like that. Get an extra set of eyes. It's always good to have an extra set of eyes, but if you have dyslexia, it's probably a really good idea to have a second set of eyes because your brain tends to compensate for the disability. So, you want to have another eyes who don't have that particular disorder. From a cinematography point of view, what are your thoughts about The Last WoW Cinematic Reckoning? Haven't seen it. Actually, I haven't interacted with Retail WoW in quite some time. Anytime I could comb the desert, I think of Spaceballs. Yes, when they're dragging the comb through it. Have you guys heard this? The Majestica cover of Spaceballs? You guys got to hear this. I can't put it up right now just because it'll be a problem. Here we go. I'm going to share it for you guys. Let's listen to that. This is great. All right. Let's see here. I actually like heavy use of accents in dialogue for flavor, such as Uncle Remus stories and some Mark Twain, but I can see why some people will find it off-putting. Anything that disrupts the flow. A little bit is good. Too much is bad. Just like anything. It's dose dependent. One proofreading shortcut I sometimes use is to sentences or paragraphs I've written with a similar section from a book or type. Oh, to compare them, yeah. So compare something you've written to a similar book and see how they line up. And that's actually probably a pretty good idea because you can kind of compare the style, see what readers like with their style. So if you're writing vampire romance, you look at how Stephanie Meyer would write something and kind of think like, oh, that's a little bit simpler than what I write. Maybe I should simplify my prose just a bit. That tends to work pretty good. Yeah. So that's good. All right. So let's see what time it's. Only 7:15. Anyway, so let me go back to these different levels of editing and just talk slightly bit more about them. So when you're looking at the story stuff, here's a really good way to tell that your story is firing, okay? Go through your manuscript and see how much space there is between each major plot event. So write down a synopsis of your story. This actually can help you a lot. If you write down a synopsis of your story, you're going to be writing down what are the major plot events. Find each of them and see how much space there is between them. If you find that there's a really large space between any two plot events in your synopsis, so your synopsis would be this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, right? If there's a big space between any two events, look at that more carefully because chances are you have some superfluous stuff in there. You might be dragging a little bit. My big concern when I'm writing, and I think people who've read my books can attest to this, is pacing. I want my books to go and never be boring. I am terrified of boring the reader, and I never want him to be bored. So when I write, if there's any kind of slow section, I start one to cut. either cut it, or let's cut it down. Let's put it somewhere else. Let's put it next to a plot event. Let's do something with this section because there's too much time. If there's like 10,000 words between big events, I'm like, it might be too much, you know. I like to have my small events happen every 500 to 1,000 words, and my big events to happen every 10,000 words to 5,000 words, 5 to 10,000 words. So that'd be a chapter, right? So each chapter is about 5,000 words. That's a big event for each one. And then my meta events, you know, the 5-act structured, like the 5 big events that will make the story, those need to happen every 20,000 words. And then you have a 100,000 word book. Bam. So if there's a long space between it, like there's this idea that the first half of a book needs to be slower than the second half. I don't really believe that. I think the first half of the book needs to be like lightning fast and on top of it, or you're going to bore a reader. And especially with an ebook, you know, if they're bored with an ebook, they're just going to like hit the back button and go read a different ebook. You know, they're just going to abandon your book. Great. You want people to read it, you know. I need advice on how to come up with a religious symbol for a fantasy religion. No particular advice, but you have to think that most religious symbols are kind of pictographic and have to do with something important with with the religion itself. So like Jainism has like a hand, different parts of Indian religions have like a swastika, which is not like a Nazi symbol historically, believe it or not. Cross, obviously, a cross for Christians, it's really simple, but it's a pictograph of a complex thing, which was Christ dying on the cross. Maybe you have a Star of David representing Judaism, which is just an historic symbol, 6 points or 2 triangles interacting. I think if people were into something that was more like Kabbalah, they might have a different symbol. I'm not sure. That's probably how I'd look at it. Look at the religious symbols we have here and see how they're pictographic of something important. So if you create a fantasy religion that's all about worshiping an alligator, well, their symbol would be something that relates to alligators, like 2 eyes, like popping out of the water. So it'd be like 2 circles with like a dot, 2 formatas, let's say. And that would be their religious symbol because that's the alligator eyes. So it would be something pictographic for what's important. Or if they worship an owl, then it would be a symbol of an owl, obviously. If their god has some sort of totem that's involved with them, then it would somehow represent that totem. You think that like in Norse religions, it would be, say, the hammer of Thor, which was kind of an upside down hammer thing. It doesn't look exactly like a hammer, it just represents a hammer. Or the crossed box thing, or the Celtic cross, circle with a cross for like the sun god, that kind of stuff. And it's a pictographic representation of what's there. So you don't want it to be too abstract. It kind of represents something important. Simplification of it, visual simplification. Ray Bradbury had a short attention span, so he wrote many short stories and fairly short books. He had to be goaded into reading Moby Dick so he could write the script for the movie. Sorry, I believe that, but I think his books are good for that. Like, Ray Bradbury was great at writing short, like, fast-paced books. They were good. Moby Dick, though, I've said this before, if there's a book that I would actually say it's better abridged, it's probably Moby Dick. I would recommend if there's an abridged version of Moby Dick, you read that before you read a full version. Because the story elements in Moby Dick and the themes are quite good. But man, there's whole chapters on like how to tie knots and crap like that. That's just not very interesting. And so for that reason, Moby Dick, yeah, it's a classic. But it's also really hard to read. Especially for a contemporary reader that's not looking at a book as like, well, here's 100 hours of entertainment for me, or here's 20 hours of entertainment. They look at a book and like, I want to experience a story and not be told how to tie knots. All right, let's see if there's anything else at the chat. Let's do last bits of chat, and we'll probably call it early here because there's just not a whole lot going on with the stream today. Not a whole lot of questions. See if there's any I missed. I'm going to give you a little bit of extra stuff. Yeah, I didn't take his short attention span as a criticism. I think it's great. Stupid question, but do you think that my pronunciation of certain words will be difficult for someone not from England would understand? Example, SETI for me is a couch to Americans? Possibly. Because I haven't heard someone call it that. But if it's important to the regional dialect, like if it's set in England and somebody calls a toilet a loo, like you could call the commode, you could call it a commode, you could call it a toilet, you could call it a loo. If you're really concerned about it, put it in a context that the reader obviously knows that loo means toilet, right? Something like that. You know, sometimes here we call the toilet the head, like especially if you're talking in military circles. I need to hit the head. Means I need to go poop, right? That's a military thing. So a lot of people don't pick up on that. They're like, hit the head. What is he talking about? It's like, he's got to go poo-poo or pee-pee. Can you tell I have toddlers? Tell I have children. One toddler and a baby. It could be a problem. I don't think it'd be a problem, though, if it's always in context. If he sat on the seedy, I don't know. I've never heard anyone call a couch a seedy or that, but I would see it in context. Like, I think that means a couch. How viable is it to write xenofiction as a first-time writer, i.e., from the point of view of a robot, fairy, monster, etc.? I think it's fine. It's no worse than anything else, and if anything, it could be very, very interesting. So I did a review of an independently published book a while back where he had lots of sections from the point of view of an alien, and those were like the best sections of the book. They were really interesting. He did a really good job with it. So I think that has potential to be super interesting. Reminds me of soda versus pop, depending on where you are in the U.S. Yeah, here it's soda. Up north it'd be pop, but if someone said pop, I would know that they meant soda. Probably just by context. What is a noble? You hear them in fantasy settings, but what exactly are they? A noble is a landowner in a feudal system. Okay, so in a feudal system, the nobility is the class of people who own the land, and the peasantry would be basically anyone that works the land. Now, depending on which period of feudalism you're looking at and which region of Europe, these have different terms and different roles. So you had a peasant would actually be a free farmer, usually, who either owned his own land or was not bound to the land, rented the land, was either a renter or owned the land, would be a peasant, or worked some other job like a woodcutter. A woodcutter would be a peasant. He doesn't work as a farmer, but he doesn't own the land. Whereas a serf was bound to the land, and they had to work the farm and pay taxes to the lord as a portion of their crop and protect, and in exchange they would be able to run into the castle if any bandits showed up. If you're looking at Scandinavia, you had a different classification, which is that you had nobility, like jarls. Basically, it's the same thing. They owned the land. Then you had free peasants, freemen, who weren't bound to the land and could do what they wanted, were, warriors, mercenaries, soldiers, whatever else. Just everybody that was free. And then you had thrall. These were slaves. They were the same as serfs, but they really were slaves. And so their role in the society was different, depending on where you're at. But nobility historically just means somebody who owns the land. So somebody with a title would mean, so in England, if I have a title in England, if I have English title means that I own land in England. Nowadays it means something different, but back in the day it would mean I own this section of land. Maybe I have a castle on that land, or a manor, or some sort of house that I can administer that land with. And then there's farmers who rent the land or who are serfs bound to the land that are on my land. So the Lord of Loxley, right? Whatever region you want to go to, right? He owned that little section of land. Settee. It's a settee. Yeah. I think fantasy writers tend to extrapolate noble to mean like anyone rich, so which has a different meaning. Like bourgeois and noble are not the same thing. Like bourgeois would mean like somebody who's a rich member of the merchant class. Maybe they own the house they live in, they have a lot of money, but they're not a noble. A noble has inherited his title from years before. A noble's really a kind of warlord when you stop and think about it historically. Like if you go far back. The maniacal Andy in Voices of the Void is pretty accurate representation of intrusive ego dystonic thoughts. I know this from experience. Okay, cool. Yeah, he's kind of crazy, and I kind of wanted to pursue that and just kind of explore that. And I have no idea if it was going to turn out well, but people seem to really like that story, so I'm glad. Does the fluff or sweet moments between characters, like just talking and just laughing, have to move the plot, or is it bad to include things like that? So I think it's best. I'm not going to say bad or good, but it is best if it is moving, either it is moving their relationship forward, like they're becoming better friends, it's revealing past information about a character, deepening bonds, or it's moving the plot forward. That is best. If they're just having banter, I think it tends to be something worthy of cutting or rewriting into a different scene. Let me give you an example from a movie. So there's a movie that some people like, which I think is bad. And that's a movie called Chasing Amy. It was written and directed by Kevin Smith, who, I know that I need to lose weight if somebody says I look like Kevin Smith. I'm like, okay, I clearly haven't been sticking on my diet if people think I look like Kevin Smith. But so this movie is like 2.5 hours long, I want to say. And it feels like 2.5 hours long. There's virtually no plot. Almost the entire movie is just this banter between characters. And if you find the banter entertaining, then the story's kind of okay. The movie's funny. If you don't find the banter all that entertaining, it's not very fun. And so I didn't find the banter all that entertaining. And in fact, I found the movie very boring. I found the characters completely unbelievable. They do things that are bizarre and make no sense. It could just be that like Kevin Smith is like, I don't know, like a degenerate, and so he wrote all his characters as like mentally deficient degenerates that do things that make no sense and have like horrible backstories. Or it could just be that he wasn't a good writer. And I actually think as I've grown up, Kevin Smith is good at writing dialogue. Which is that banter between characters that people find natural and they like. He's not good at writing stories. So that's a good example. Chasing Amy, if you'd cut about an hour out of the movie and made it a 90-minute movie, it would have been a lot better. But it would have been missing all these scenes that fans like. There's all these scenes of like comic book conventions with all these little inside jokes about comic books that I just found so tedious and so boring. It ended up becoming... Boring is one of the worst things I could say about anything. People ask, hey, what do you think of the band Tool? I'm like, they're boring. And people are like, is that bad? I'm like, that's one of the worst things I can say about something, is that it makes me bored. Even something that sounds horrible may keep me interested enough to pay attention to it. I forget Tool is on the radio. I'm like, oh, there's music playing. This is another boring song. It sounds just like the other boring song that they had right before this. Oh, this is the 7th track. It all sounds the same. Boring. What's the best way to portray a standoffish character? So make him unwilling to speak, and make a character have to like prod him to speak. I think he's going to seem standoffish. So it's like, what do you think, Mike? And he'll be like, Mike grumbled. No, give us your thoughts. I guess it's like this. Just have a character that you put him in a position where he's asked to speak and he's unwilling to speak or interact, and then he's standoffish. There you go. And then you've communicated that really effectively. I live in Iowa, and there are some people here that say soda while others say pop. I say soda. California, it's soda. And even if you said to a kid, like, let's have a pop, he'd be like, are you trying to sell me drugs? Like, no. I'm saying I want to give you a pop. Are you trying to molest me? What are you trying to do? You want a Coke. Oh. Now in Texas, everything is a Coke. I'm from Texas originally. So, hey, can I have a Coke? And they'd be like, what kind do you want? It's like, Coke? And they're like, okay. Right? You're like, what? You're like, can I have a Coke? What kind do you want? Sprite. It's like, you want a Coke with that? No, I want a Sprite. Or, yeah, give me a Sprite. And they wouldn't say, no, I want a Sprite. They're like, yeah, give me a Sprite. Yeah, I want a Dr. Pepper. Now, like, it communicates the idea, but if you're not aware, if you're not aside of that and you go into that, you'd be like, wait, everything is Coke here. It's not soda, it's not pop, it's Coke. It's all Coke. Everything's Coke. You know what I mean? So, it's a funny thing. And in some places, drink always means alcoholic. They're like, I want a drink. Can I get a drink? They're like, yeah, what do you want? And it's like, can I get water? And they're like, I thought you wanted a drink. Why didn't you just ask for water? It's like, can I get a drink? Yeah, what do you want? Iced tea. And they bring you like a Long Island iced tea. I think that was in that 70s show. But that's an actual thing. In some places, drink always means alcohol. Will you ever do a video on magic systems? I have already done one, and you can look it up. It's actually a very popular YouTube video called Fantasy Does Not Excuse Reality. Or Fantasy Does Not Excuse Impossibility. So you can look it up. And it's all magic systems. And I've done more content here and there on magic systems. Isn't Kevin Smith skinny now? I don't think I would use the word skinny. He's less fat. And he's lost a lot of weight, I think, which is good for him. I think he had a heart attack, which kind of made him wake up to how he was eating and how he's approaching his health and made him turn it around, which is great. The thing is, like, if you're 400 pounds and you lose a bunch of weight, you'll never really look skinny because you end up with like all this extra like fat, like, you end up with like fat hanging off your arms and stuff, and like all over your body. It's better than being like unhealthy, but it's you never really like fit your clothes right unless you have that skin removed. Like they have a surgery where they'll like, they'll take the skin and like stitch it up, get rid of all the extra skin. You lose. I remember I met somebody who had that happen. They lost like 300 pounds at one point. They end up with all this extra skin, and when they took it off, it was like another 50 pounds came off. 50 pounds of skin they took off. Wow. Not of fat, just of like the loose epidermis, the loose dermis, without a lot of fat in it. But that's good. When should we start working on our covers? We'll talk about that next week. I'm going to do a 2-week thing, and I'm going to have some content on that this weekend. I usually work on my cover after I finish my rough draft and before I edit. Now, I'm not saying to do that for this project because I really want people to focus on this process and not get distracted by covers. I'll talk about how to either find a cover artist or design your own cover in the next couple weeks. I'm trying to figure out how I want to do that because I want to come out with some extra content that's really focused on that will also bring in more viewers to the channel. Maybe just give a couple of tips for, like, here's 3 easy covers in 3 genres. And what I might do is just have a poll. Let me see if I can just do a poll right now. We'll do a poll of the people here. Let's do like a straw poll. And we'll see what genre you're in. Okay. And so we'll have a couple options. I'll do mystery thriller. What are some other ones that people might be into? I'm trying to think if there's any other big genres that people like to write in that we might want to hit. I don't know. All right, let's hit this poll up here. See if you guys can hit that up. So there's a poll here, and then we'll see. So go ahead and hit that poll. It's in the chat if you're watching after this stream. So if you're watching the stream after the fact, it should be in the chat with the big yellow David Stewart, which is me. yellow to identify me. And click that and tell me what genre you're writing in, and that'll give me an idea of what kind of cover designs I should really focus on. Because every genre has its own cover conventions, and I want to get into those. I didn't put Western in there, but if you have Western, just leave it in a comment. Western it just isn't probably as popular, I'm guessing, as some of these other ones. So mysteries and thrillers have a certain way that you design the cover. Fantasy and sci-fi each have different approaches. Literary fiction, which would just be, you're writing a story about Mike and Sue, and they live in Dayton, Ohio, and they're having a breakup, right? That would be literary fiction. Kind of stuff I don't really like to read, but if it's for you, it's yours. It's your story, and I want to help you have a cover that's going to be great. And from there, I'm going to give some information for how do you find a cover that matches that, and then also how do you, if you need to do it really cheap. Like you just don't have the money. And I've been there, and I'm always there. I'm always where I don't want to spend money, because I don't have stuff by throwing money away. I have stuff by being incredibly cheap with everything all the time. That's kind of who I am. And I say that, and I'm like, man, I got a lot of guitars, and I got all kinds of, it's like, yeah, but like every guitar, like the guitar collection was slowly built over time, like painstakingly. I never threw money away on guitars. And I'm like, man, I got a lot of money on these walls. But it's over time. So yeah, you want to stay away. Right now we're just looking at big stuff. You want to stay away. It's like, oh, I'm doing, like Rand. Theology, ancient history, magic. That's probably fantasy. It could be historical. We could do either historical fiction or fantasy. Historical fantasy is a thing, but its genre conventions are fluid. You're going to do the book cover for whatever genre is closer. So if it's closer to fantasy, you're going to do a fantasy book cover. If it's closer to historical fiction, you're going to do a historical fiction book cover. Talk about what the purpose of each element of a cover is. Like, the point of this cover. These covers are both conveying an emotion with this red, this blood red, which is like, this is going to be gory. This conveys an emotion with the purple and the orange and the red, which is that this is going to be horror and this is going to be supernatural, right? This color, green, always confers like epic fantasy, green, and Odysseys. Classic fantasy is always in green. We have a Conan book. What's the emotion there? It's like a fearful emotion. Notice orange is featured prominently. Orange has a feeling of ancientness and dirt and grit, right? So if you're doing a Western, orange and yellow are great colors for that. And I'll talk about all this stuff. I'm doing a fantasy romance. Which one do I pick? Fantasy. You'd only do romance if it is like explicitly romance. If the main story is a romance, but it's a fantasy story like Night Circus or something, it's fantasy. If the main story is romance and it's in a fantasy universe, it's romance. And by romance, I mean if it's focused on two characters having sex, it's romance. If it's focused on the development of a relationship through fantastical events, or if the romance is a B story, you're in fantasy. Romance, the sex is always the big part of the A story, and you got to hammer that. So if I were to write like, or you could even do like fantasy erotica, but that would just be erotica. It depends. I think it kind of depends on the focus of the sex. Although every romance writer will say like, it's not about the sex. I'm like, yeah, but it pretty much is. It's about how you get there for sure. But if you include the more graphic matriculation of the sexual relationship, you're in the romance genre. And if you just kind of gloss over that, then you're probably in a different genre. Something I noticed. I'm thinking of having my cover be the love interest in human form, looking at her reflection, which is her as a fae. I can actually do that. I might do a live design. If somebody wants like a live design, I don't know how I would do that for someone. I might do a live design to exhibit some of this stuff. But I could totally design that. What I would probably do, I mean, this is way more complicated than you should ever think about doing as a beginner. But keep in mind, I've designed a lot of book covers, not just for me, but for other people. So I've done this. I'd actually have a model, a really beautiful girl, and I would phonomanipulate her so she's whatever you imagine as a fae, an elf. And so I'd put some ears on her, and that's not that hard to do. And then I'd just make her mirror image and put a mirror on a layer above that and color grade it so that it's the right color for your genre, which is going to be probably green or turquoise, and then or blue. And those kind of colors around green and blue are good for fantasy. Do some great typography, like what I tend to do. This is good. That's my best. Needle Ashes, Water of Awakening has great typography. This is good typography here, and then have great title. Damn, there it is. I can already imagine what it would be. Now, here's a danger, guys. So here's a danger. And I should talk more about this next week too, but if you do not have experience designing book covers and you hire someone who has a lot of experience designing book covers, you should not tell them what you want. You should tell them what genre you're in. You should tell them what's relevant in the story. You can say, I'm kind of thinking of this, but don't try to dictate what that person's going to do, because that person's going to design the right cover for that genre if they're good. There's a problem where authors end up telling their cover designers everything that the cover designer has to do. I want it like this, and I want it this wide, and they end up with a cover that's worse than they would otherwise get. Because if you don't understand the design principles that govern this area of art creation, then you're going to ask for things which actually don't do what you want them to do. The main purpose of a book cover is to get people's attention. And you want them to see the book cover on Amazon and be like, huh, I'll click that and I'll read the blurb. And the blurb is on track. You're like, I think I'm gonna buy that book. Oh, it's on Kindle Unlimited. Sweet. I'm just gonna download it and I'll read it next Tuesday. That's what you want. You want to convert. So it's to get people's attention. And the way that you're going to do that is actually not by being unique. It's by being slightly unique, not super unique. Just like here's a bunch of fantasy book covers, and mine will stick out because it's green, and they're like, oh, green, That reminds me of Lord of the Rings. And then they'll see there's a pretty girl, and it's an illustration. Click on it. Read the description. That's a good book cover. Needle Ash is actually a good book cover too. Green. Oh, it kind of stands out. I see this great typography. There's a soldier on it. Oh, kind of want to see what this book's about. Click it. They might see book 2, and they're like, oh, pretty girl. I'll click it. And they're like, oh, it's part 2. I guess I'll read part 1. Attractive. Now, believe it or not, this is one of my simplest covers, and it's one of my best converting. It's just a picture of a crown with some magic effects in Photoshop on a burgundy red background with some blue letters. Great color use, contrasting colors. Notice there's only 2 colors. Well, there's 3. There's yellow, but we kind of perceive the yellow as white. There's really blue and burgundy, and that's it. Only a couple colors. Yellow and green and white, right? Splash of red. Little splash of red in her hair. Did the same thing for Needle Ash, if you notice. Green and yellow, splash of red, his armor. I actually color graded him to get this blood in this armor to look red and everything else to be kind of muted. You actually don't want a lot of color. Voices of the Void. One main color, orange, secondary color, purple. Great contrasting colors. Yellow and purple are contrasting with each other, so I like to go 1 over, so they're not super contrast. Like yellow and purple are really super contrasting. They're really they're too complementary. So I go 1 over to orange, and then it looks great. I could talk about this kind of crap for hours. I really should get like an artist on to like talk about this stuff, like color theory and things like that. Because if you don't have a background in this stuff, and I do, my mom was an artist herself. She was a painter, and taught me all this stuff. If you don't have a background in art, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you may just miss because you're not trained to look for it, or you may not realize like what is the difference between these. Like how does this one look so much better than this one? And so when you hire a cover artist, you want somebody who has that knowledge and is just gonna do it. Let's see here. I don't like the novel style of dialogue structure. Would it be odd to do like a screenplay style of dialogue with the character names in a novel? Yes, it would. It would be weird, and it would probably not be good. I don't recommend it. You want to stick to the style that people are used to. You're trying to figure out how to access the story. Like, I don't like how comic books have these panels. Can I do like a comic book with no panels, just like one picture per page? I'm like, you shouldn't, because people have a certain expectation for how that format's going to work. You should stick with that. Remember, you're trying to get a story into somebody's mind. You're using the medium to communicate that. It's like how you wouldn't have a movie with no visuals, or you wouldn't have a movie that just had no dialogue. Well, you could actually, but you probably wouldn't have a movie where like the dialogue was never spoken and was only in subtitles because you don't like hearing actors speak. You gotta go with the format that people are used to. You make your own book covers? Amazing, I do. For pretty much all my books. There's a reason why I do that. Main reason is it's cheap. I can pay myself $0 to make a book cover. The other one is, at one point I was like putting out books pretty fast, and I really didn't want to wait around for an artist to do the book cover. Sometimes it takes them months to get around to making a book cover because they have so many clients, or they're so stacked, or to get an artist that's good, you got to wait. So I'm like, I'll just do this myself. I'll just learn it myself. And so through many different practice iterations, and including doing my own early covers, I learned lots of little techniques and thoroughly evaluated design, and then kind of applied my prior knowledge of graphic design and my prior knowledge of art into designing book covers. And really the main thing I figured out was not just the techniques of how to operate Photoshop, or I did some of them in Inkscape because I was really cheap and didn't want to pay for Photoshop. But I learned the design principles which go into actually making a book cover, which is probably something that's not taught in school. So if you can find someone who talks about those, it's helpful. Part of the inspiration for my story actually comes from a sci-fi painting by Manchu. Cool. I wrote a story that was inspired by Caspar David Friedrich painting. Actually, it might come out this year. If I get done with this in a timely manner, maybe I'll put that one out. I have a couple books that are manuscripts that I need to polish up and publish. I didn't publish them because I wasn't sure how I felt about them. But I think I'm just going to put them out and let people decide if they like them or hate them. And if they hate them, that's okay. You can read a different. I'll give you a different book if you hate it. How do you make sure you don't have too many characters in a story? Great question. I don't have a firm answer other than the importance of characters and how much space they occupy depends on how long the book is, how good you are at writing characters efficiently, and how important the character is to that story. Because Crown of Sight has, let me count the characters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 characters and 24,000 words or something. That's a lot. Usually you're going to have fewer characters, but it's all about how much focus is on each character. The focus is really spread out in this one. Lots of different scenes with different characters, and it's really all about the plot and the world, and not a whole lot of like, let's have characters have deep conversations with each other. There's not a lot of that. So it depends on the story. So there's no real hard answer. Generally, you're going to have, if you're doing like an ABC style story, the A stories focus on the protagonist, should take up most of the space of the book. B story is going to be focused on the love interest, and the C story is going to be focused on some other character solving problems. So you might have a main character, a secondary character that's a love interest, and a tertiary character, and the rest are static. They can be in one scene, two scenes. There's no upper limit on how many characters you can have. Should I vary the length of my dialogue? Sometimes my dialogue is only a sentence or two for each character, and sometimes I have large chunks of dialogue with little prose between. I wouldn't worry about it. It's not that important. As long as things flow well, it's fine. You don't have to have people stop and give a soliloquy or a monologue. What's the best way to present a character who softens and opens up throughout the story? Boy, that's a hard question to answer. Well, you have to start with them being hard. and then you have to find some vulnerability that they can't avoid, and then have to open up to another character. So if I'm just riffing, it'd be maybe there's a character who's he's just really hard and standoffish and closed up and doesn't ever talk about his emotions, and he finds a lost little girl, and he's forced to be comforting to that little girl, and his love interest is there, and she sees that, and that provokes some feelings, and so she says that, and she says, I really appreciated how you were able to do that. I've never seen you do that. And then he finally opens up to her because he feels safe with her. So a lot of people are closed off because they don't feel safe talking about their emotions. And he's like, yeah, well, my dad died and I had an abusive stepdad. And that would be the reveal. Why is this character like this? Well, he had this great relationship with his father. His father died. His mother married an asshole. That asshole was abusive to him. And so he's not really willing to open up to other people. He hasn't felt that same way that he's felt with his father who died. And now he finally feels safe enough with this character to open up. Or that could be female. It could be anything. There's no set gender for this. I just used male as an example because that tends to be a male response, is to kind of shut off emotions and be a little bit more hidden, hide your emotions a little bit more. Versus a female response tends to be a little bit more up and down with the emotions when they have a traumatic background. And that's not 100% with anyone, right? You could easily switch that around. Just where my mind was going with that, the tendency. The story I'm writing is technically science fiction. There's no actual magic, but has fantasy horror feel and based on a fantasy concept. It's set at sea. Any cover advice? Well, you want to nail the emotion and the setting. So, I don't know. I'd have to think about that because I've never designed a cover like that, but I probably have waves. Then I might have if there's a sea monster trying to eat them, I'd probably have some sort of jaws beneath it. And then a boat that looks fantastical or something. But then that says horror, right? To me, that's like, oh, that's a monster book. That's a horror book. So if you're trying to communicate science fiction, it's hard. Maybe it would be... There's a bunch of ways to do it. I'm going to give a couple of basic templates for this kind of stuff. You could avoid the boat altogether. It's something like a setting like it's entirely on a boat. You kind of want to communicate that because that's something that can be really alluring to a reader. But if you want to go straight horror, I would have a boat, a side view of a boat, and like a monster or something like that underneath the water. That's the main thing I do. There's no humanizing element there, but it's a scary looking cover. Usually I'll go through some principles. You want like a human element, so like a human shape or human face somehow is what you usually want. You notice most of my covers, like this one converts really well. There's no human element. You don't have to have it. This one has a face, right? Pretty much communicating the emotion, that horror emotion. This one, obviously, it's just a girl in a forest. Awesome, right? This cover image, by the way, is done by Kerem Bayat, same guy who does Twilight Force. So, great artist. He's from Turkey. What do you think about using bright, colorful, painted covers like the old pulps had? Those usually had the type of cover that makes me most inclined to buy a book. I think that's what I'm using. That's what I'm going to use for this book that I'm writing now. I have a comic artist who's going to do it. It's going to be very just evocative of the old style, I think. And that's kind of where I'm going. I want a pulp feel to mine. However, I'm doing things different. If you actually want to hit the genre, what you should do is do whatever the genre's doing, which right now is mostly photo covers. So you probably wouldn't do that too hard if you want to sell. I'm going to do it to be different because I like to roll the dice. Something you guys maybe not have figured out about me, as pretty much every story for me, I look at it as a dice roll. Because if I do everything the exact same way everybody else does it, there's no guarantee for anything. But if I do something a little bit different, if it's same but different, if it's like, oh, here's a sci-fi cover, but oh, it has that pulp painted style, it pops out a little bit while fitting in. It's probably not going to fit in at all, but I want it to be different. I have an opportunity for bigger growth, although you also have an opportunity for it to be completely ignored. So it just depends. I had to erase a character I liked because I felt the scene he was in that showed the characterization was better served another way. F for Clarence and his pregnant wife. There you go. You got to kill your darlings, I think is what Stephen King said. And that's fine. I think my main antagonist is only in 3 or 4 scenes. That's fine. Sauron is in like 0 scenes. Aran is in like 2 scenes in the entire Chronicles of Prydain. It's okay. The antagonist is mainly just kind of setting the anti-plot in motion, if you want to think of it like that. It's okay that you don't see him a lot. You mentioned that you didn't enjoy Kevin Smith's movie banter. Do you like the banter? Oh, I didn't say I didn't like the banter in Chasing Amy. I thought it was really bad in Chasing Amy. But it's good in some other movies. Like I like Jane Silent Bob Strike Back as a comedy movie because it's just silliness. You mentioned that you didn't enjoy Kevin Smith's banter. Do you like banter from the 1930s screwball comedies like It Happened One Night, Marx Brothers movies, etc.? I actually don't really like the Marx Brothers stuff. It's okay, but I think I'm too separated from their time to really get the humor. The hero character is like a high-level officer with a dark past, but I want him to slowly open up to the heroine over time after their arranged marriage. Ooh, that sounds like fun. Yeah, so I set up like that. Some kind of situation where he's forced. In fact, that would be a great... The thing that I described to you would be like a great device. Something that he has to be kind of... He has to open up because they find an orphaned little girl. And of course, that's also going to be really appealing to female readers. So... Because like the female fantasy for the male interest is strength and also mainly strength, but they're able to capture that and make it theirs, and therefore it becomes tamed and becomes kind of domesticated. So this idea, like if you have a Han Solo, like a bad boy character that's dangerous and violent and powerful and has the potential to do violence, that represents a protection element. But you harness that person to domesticate them and soften them, and that's the arc that's very attractive for female readers. So you see this in romances a lot. So just full on romance, like you have a character who's like a Navy SEAL, and he's completely wild and doesn't want to settle down with any woman, and of course he settles down with the love interest at the end because she captures his heart or whatever it's going to be. She tames. It's like the taming of a wild beast. So you need your male interest to be like a wild beast that has to be tamed, and you tame him by exposing him to situations where his good nature forces him to be more tame. So the little girl needs help. She can't find her parents, or her parents are killed or something else. And so the character is forced to be moral where he would normally be amoral and leave somebody on their own. Because it's a little girl, it affects him. And so he acts in a more forthright way. And thus the taming begins. And it also exposes to the female character, and therefore to the reader, especially a female reader, that there's a growth happening in the direction they want. So that's a very appealing idea, I think. I think that's actually a great idea for a B story in general. As you have a male that kind of opens up and becomes more emotional throughout the book. Very appealing, I think. In fact, that's Twilight. That's exactly what they do in Twilight. Edward is this undomesticatable bad boy, and then he's slowly domesticated. Even though my story is technically science fiction, I want to sell it more as horror. Think The Thing. Okay. Then yeah, the cover I described would probably be good. But they initially present themselves as beautiful women. Ooh, I like that too. You might have like a woman with like her mouth open, and then there's like claws coming out of her mouth. I could actually design something that'd be fun like that. But I could see lots of different ways that you could do that. Jared says, I introduced the villain in my book after a few chapters. Like we hear about him in the previous chapters, and then we're finally properly introduced to him. That's fine. Sometimes it takes a while. You want the antagonist needs to be introduced or Mine doesn't really have an obvious antagonist, but the conflict needs to be introduced by like at least, the first 15% of the book. So if you take a while to introduce the antagonist, that is fine. He doesn't have to be in the opening scenes at all. That is to say, it is indeed horror, but I want to sell it more as fantasy horror rather than science fiction, as it has more of a fantasy horror type of feel. You probably sell it as horror, gothic horror. Probably not like fantasy horror and science fiction horror, remember, are not genres in Amazon. I know this like surprises some people, but they don't exist. So it's just going to be in horror. So you should just go with horror and make sure you have some fantasy elements on it too. If Voices of the Void were to be made into a movie, who would you want to play the leads? I don't know any actors' names. Yeah, I don't know too many actors' names anymore, so I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. So, Mariella, is her name Mariella? Suddenly I'm spacing. I'm like, her name's not Mariella, is it? I thought it was. Yeah, it was Mariella. Okay. For some reason, I was thinking of Mariana, but no, it was Mariella. You're right. I don't know why I spaced on that. People are like, he doesn't even know his own character names. Like, dude, I've written a lot of characters. There's a Mariana, I think, in another book. Anyway. So this is something that I don't think too many people picked up on because it's kind of put in the background, but people in this future in Voices of the Void still have all their ethnic identities. So all the people in the colony, you notice, have kind of Iberian names for the most part. It's because they're primarily racially, like from the Iberian Peninsula. So they're like Spanish and Portuguese descent, and their political group, their political part that controls space is called the Iber. So they're racially, they're like Southern, they're like Spanish people, right? Portuguese people, maybe Northern Africans from Morocco a little bit, but that group of ethnicities is one group. And then of course the main character, Andy, he's English, right? The Anglo, these are just like the white Anglos, it's their political group. And then so I also imagine, of course, like there's going to be, there's an African political group, and there's a Japanese one maybe, that far enough in the future our ethnic organizations tend to focus on culture groups. Like I imagine a future where our ethnic differences don't go away and our cultures don't get amalgamated into some kind of weird, nothing of all cultures mixed together like Star Trek. Like at least like most Star Trek. Most Star Trek imagines like a one world government future, one world culture. I'm like, nah. I don't want that, and I don't believe that'll happen. People have their cultures and they love their cultures, and their cultures will persist and ought to persist. They won't be exactly the same, but the idea that people would just in the future, as we go out to space, just abandon all ethnic ties to each other seems kind of ridiculous. Doesn't mean that everybody's at war or like everybody's racist towards each other. It just means, the political groupings, just like today in a nation state, tend to be focused around ethnic origins. That's all, So I'd imagine somebody who's more traditionally white, and somebody who, or English looking, so they'd have light eyes and maybe some brown hair, and then somebody who looks Iberian, somebody who has classical Iberian traits for Mariella. Somebody who looks Spanish, more olive skin, dark black hair, dark eyes, maybe slightly, different nose, maybe, just a more Spanish look. That's how I kind of imagined it. Let's see here. Yeah, definitely. But through the story, you find that his recklessness is really a cover for his need to be punished for the past deeds that he's committed along with his career. Interesting. Kind of reminds me of Guts from Berserk. He's constantly putting his life at risk to figure out the meaning of life. Sammy, for the cover, I have no art background and no experience with photo editing, and I also don't want to pay for cover. What do? So I'll help you. with that. So one option is there's some free book cover templates that exist on the internet. A couple book designers have some. I will create some basic guides for some you can make if you're in the right genre. And so you're still going to have to pay because you're going to have to license the images. So it's going to cost you 10 or 20 bucks. We're talking 10 or 20 bucks versus hundreds of dollars to have a good cover designed, right? You can also buy a pre-made for 50 bucks, which is also probably a good idea too. Thank you for the English acknowledgement. Yeah. I don't know, man. I'm a mixture of things, but not mostly English. I'm mostly Scottish. No. What am I? I'm trying to figure out what I mostly am. I'm a quarter Cherokee. So my grandma was Cherokee. My dad was Scottish. I mean, my dad's father was Scottish. My mom's family's all Irish. But my dad's family's also Dutch. So I'm like, I don't know, I'm some mixture of things. The brown eyes are from the Cherokee background. A little bit. I think I'm probably a bit more Cherokee than Elizabeth Warren with her 1,024th Cherokee. My dad just had dark skin, I just came out all pale. I don't know what happened. But like, you put my arm up to him, I'm like, Dad, you're like brown. How am I so white? Should I keep the name of the human races in my story the same, or should I change the name of them? Would it be immersion breaking if I'm talking about elves and then talk black people? Yeah. I think it would be. Let's go with Elder Scrolls. So I don't think it's that big a deal. So let's look at what other people did. So let's look at Tolkien first. Tolkien had the Haradrim, which were not blacks. They weren't Africans. So usually you say, oh, these are Africans and therefore Tolkien's a racist because he describes them as like slit-eyed, swarthy men with lolling red tongues, I think, was what he described them as. Which sounds great, sounds fierce. I don't think he was imagining Africans because Africans have big, open brown eyes, not slits of eyes. And like, well, maybe he's describing Asians. It's like, no, he describes Easterlings as kind of the Asian. So instead of saying they're Asian, he calls them Easterlings. And instead of saying black, he calls them Haradrim. They're not really black, but the Haradrim race. So they're a version of men. They're evil men. Elder Scrolls, you have several races which are explicitly human. There's Mer and Man. So there's Mer, which is high elves, or the Altmer, right, which are the high elves. And then the Bosmer, which are the wood elves, the little wood elves. And then the Dunmer, which are the dark elves. So you have three different elf races. And then there's the Falmer, who are is it the Falmer? Or a different type of elf? They're the ones that are underground, right? They used to be like snow elves or something. I don't remember the lore exactly. Sorry. I've only played like 900 hours of Elder Scrolls. I don't remember all the lore. So you have those, right? And then there's Man, which is... Then there was races, right? The Breton, which obviously is meant to be, Celtic people, British type people, Anglo-Celtic. They're Bretons. In fact, it's funny because Brittany is not in Britain, it's in France, and it's a Celtic group with its own Celtic language. Fun. But it's like a dying out language. There's like 200 people who speak Breton, which is I think the language of Brittany. Anyway, there's Bretons, there's Imperials, which live in Cyrodiil, or Cyrodiilians, and then there's the Nords, which live up in the north. So there's three different men. And then, of course, you have the Khajiit, the kitties, the kitty cats, and then the Argonians, the lizard dudes. So there's different groups of race. Oh, yeah, and the Red Guards. So the Red Guards are black people. The Bretons are Celtic British people. The Imperials are Italians. And the Nords, obviously, are Scandinavians. And Asians are nowhere to be seen in the Elder Scrolls. There's no Chinese people, no Indians in Elder Scrolls. It's just Italians, British people, and Vikings and black people. Those are the three. Although in older Elder Scrolls game, the Red Guards are like explicitly look very African, and they still look very African in Elder Scrolls 5, but they're always wearing like North African clothing. They're wearing, I don't remember what the head wraps are called. They're wearing wraps around their head, like desert attire, robes, rather than helmets and shirts and jerkins. So it's just a fun thing. So look at what those did and probably do the same thing. So if there's some dudes that are Asians, you wouldn't call them Asians in a fantasy world. You'd say Easterlings. And if they're black, you might just call them Southrons. That might be what they were called in Lord of the Rings too, Southrons. Haradrim. Come up with a name for them and then describe them as like having, they had dark skin and, their hair was short and curly. And people are like, oh, talking about Africans, right? I think some people have like a little bit of a trepidation of like trying to describe the physical traits of a non-white racial person. It's like, oh, I don't want to say that they had narrow eyes or something. It's like, I don't want to say that they're, I don't want to just describe the fact that they're Asian. It's like, it's okay. You're just describing physical traits. There's nothing racist about saying he had dark skin. People have dark skin. People have dark skin that aren't from Africa. So if you want it to be clear that they look like they're, African, then you describe some African traits, which are going to be dark skin, some curly hair, whatever else. Whatever other traits you want to think of. Those are two that are going to stand up. Because you could say like wide nose, but not all Africans have wide noses. That's pretty... West Africans tend to, but there's nothing set with that. Whereas if I said, oh, he had pale skin and blue eyes and blonde hair, people are like, German! Scandinavian! He was a tall man with a long red beard. They'd be like, yeah, this dude's from Sweden. Yeah, people get it. Let's see here. Yeah, the orcs are the Orsimer. They're technically elves. That's true. Southpaw's right. I missed a bunch of stuff. Let's see here. The original Star Trek presented a future in which everyone got along, but still had strong ties to their own cultures. Scotty was 100% Scottish. That's true. Chekhov was very proud Russian. That's right. But they're like politically all the same. Like it's one political union, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Will you ever watch or review any new anime or manga? Probably. There was still a sort of patriotism. Chekhov always bragged about Russians having invented everything. Sort of like how people still have regional identities despite the federal government. That's true. That's a good point. I'm a mixture of French, Welsh, German, and Irish. Yeah, mixing's already happening in the States. That's true. That's okay. I've got Irish and Scottish in me with some Jamaican, English, and Spanish, so I'm a minimum cocktail. I don't look British, but then I speak in an English accent. They're like, oh, you're from Britain? Yeah, this was an old joke, right? It's like, here's a picture, and they show a black guy, and it's like, what do you say? It's like, oh, he's an African American. It's like, except he's British. He lives in England, which makes you a presumptuous. What was it? I don't remember. So it's like, we see in America, we're like, that's an African American. It's like, he's from Nigeria. He's just African. He's from South Africa. He's just African, right? Oh, look at that. There's so many African Americans in France. It's like, no, that's a black Frenchman, right? That's a black man who lives in France. Yeah, the Orsum or the orcs are elves that were corrupted when Boethia ate their god and created Malakath. I don't remember that detail, but I remember that. If you want to get, is it Boethia? You have to get that mace. So in Oblivion, you have to cast the spell that reduces your personality before you can get the mace. No, it's not Boethia. Mullet Ball. The Mullet Ball's mace. You got to be really ugly. It's the Daedra who only likes the orcs. And I remember I created a spell just to make me super ugly so that the statue would talk to me. Oh, I see the Akaviri are Asians in Elder Scrolls and they come from a different continent. Now, here's the thing though. They're also described as like snake-like. So I thought they were like, they have katanas and stuff. Totally, they're Asian, except I thought they were like snake people too. Are you aware that the trend, nicknamed Gingercide, of redheaded characters getting disproportionately race-swapped in movies and TV? Do you think it's a coincidence or intentional? I don't know. I don't watch a lot of TV and movies, so it doesn't affect my mental state. But It's probably intentional because in just the fact that like a person with red hair can't be any more white. It's obvious that they're from like they're from Northern Europe if they have red hair and freckles, which my mom has red hair and freckles. And my daughter might be redheaded. How am I going to keep her safe? I'm going to have to kill every male in this town to keep her safe. I'm kidding, of course. Government, if you're listening. All right. Yeah, because they're really white. Whereas a dude with, like, if it's me, right? Now I'm pretty white, but I have, like, dark eyes, dark hair, you know. In the right circumstances, someone would be like, you could be, like, Mexican, maybe, right? All depending on context. I used to play in a banda. People come up and start talking to me in Spanish. I'd be, like, on my heels, like, trying to talk back to them. I'm like, I don't speak Spanish. They'd be like, you don't? I'm like, oh, you're white. Yeah. There's white people in Mexico, too. People with light skin, I mean. Sorry I'm late. I was talking to U.S. Army recruiters. I'll be heading down to MEPS next week, Friday. Okay. Wasn't younglings a term in Star Wars? It was. I described one of the main characters in one of my books as bronze-skinned with pure white hair and silver eyes. That works. Say bronze-skinned to me means, it's going to mean like kind of Middle Eastern or maybe Greek. I tend to think Greek is like olive. But yeah. Charlize Theron is an African American. Literally. She's from South Africa. Romans considered Africa to be the top part of the continent. Yeah. So the Africans were like the Carthaginians, which were white. They were Greek. They had Greek features, I should say. It might have been a Greek colony at one point. If you're afraid of sounding racist, just have a racist character describe them through dialogue. Then when actually introduce a character that race, everything you say will still sound mild. Yeah, that's a funny idea. Like, they do this in Elder Scrolls too. They have like the Argonians and the Khajiit are always making jokes about like they make cat jokes. It's like the Khajiit are always licking their own butt, you know. There are snake people in Akavir as well as also monkey people and tiger people. Whoa! It's Kung Fu Panda. What's your view on portraying mixed races, disadvantaged characters without the problems one might expect? I think an example I've seen is Harry Potter coming from an abusive household. Whoa, I don't know how those two went together. Mixed races or disadvantaged characters. I think by Harry Potter you're talking about disadvantaged. I don't know how to do mixed race because I'm not really, I have different racial background, but I don't experience mixed race as an identity. I'm just like a white guy. King David is supposed to have had red hair. I think there were some Egyptians that had red hair. What are your thoughts on The Wizard of Oz? It's been a long time since I've seen or read either, so I don't feel comfortable just like waxing on it. Anyway, guys, we're actually out of time. We're way out of time now. Started getting a lot of comments and questions. Revisions. Here's the big picture. Start with the story. Make the story work. Go down to the scenes. Make sure the scenes are working. Rewrite if they're not working. Put those events in other places. If a scene isn't moving your story forward, consider condensing it or combining it with another scene. You get down to the style element. Make sure that your prose is all in one style and that the sentences sound good. That's getting down to the nitty-gritty of stylistic editing. And then copy editing is where you're making sure style is correct, basically. Make sure you use the right words in all places. And then finally, you're going to get down to proofreading. And proofreading is fixing typos. So those are the steps that you need to go through to figure out how to revise this book. We'll pick it up from here next week, and I'll begin talking about publication stuff. Keep watch on the channel. I'm going to have several videos, and make sure you're on the mailing list because I'll probably just have a list of them that I'll mail out. Like, here's the videos on what you need to know about book covers, how to format your book, how to format a paperback, how to make a PDF, what fonts to use. I'll talk about everything. What font to use when you make your paperback. I'll tell you which fonts to use. I'll tell you exactly what margins to use, what paper size to use, how to set up your headers, how to format the style so that it looks perfect, how to then figure out how that's going to make a wraparound cover, how to make your wraparound cover based on your book cover. I want to talk about all those things. They're super technical, so they're going to take longer than I could probably do in a live stream. So I'm probably going to have to do some extra content for that. So keep tuned for that. I'm going to try to make it as informative and concise as possible. What you need to know to make a good formatted book, because it's really cool to be able to have a paperback. About 30 to 40% of my books are paperbacks as far as sales, just very high. That's way higher than most modern authors. But for whatever reason, fantasy readership, they like to buy physical books. Readership that is interested in pulps, which tend to be interested in my work. So if you're interested in like Conan, you like my work because it's similar, or you're interested in Moorcock, you like my books because they're similar. Those kinds of people tend to like physical books. So I sell a lot of physical books. It's nice to have that option. Increases your sales. Because you're doing print on demand, I'm going to show you how to do the print on demand stuff through Amazon. It's really easy. You don't have to print any. You don't have to budget for printing and trying to sell stuff like we used to have to do 10, 15 years ago. You don't have to worry about any of that. You just put it up, and if someone wants a paperback, Amazon prints it, mails it to them. And it's that simple. It's very, very easy to do now. Okay. So that's probably it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.